Welcome, everyone. Good to see you here on this beautiful, sunny, chilly day. I'm pleased to introduce Fernando Bizzarro. Fernando spent 4 years here from 2012 to 2016. And then for some reason, he defected someplace on the East Coast in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But he was a very beloved, esteemed member of our scholarly and personal community from 2012 to 2016. He finished his dissertation at Harvard a few years ago. He's an assistant professor of political science at Boston College and also has a postdoc from Yale. Fernando, great to have you back.
Thank you, Scott. Oh, thank you.
And to the online folks, that there is a button through which you can submit questions.
Thank you. So thank you, Scott, and thank you all for coming. I am elated to be here. It's not only great to be a member of this community, it is a personal joy for me to be here, and I am deeply honored to be back in this room on this side of the table for the first time. This room and this seminar means a lot to me. Where that gentleman is sitting right over there is where I became a comparativist, because that's where I would sit here. And I remember the day it happened, actually, was this religious experience, because I was working on a master's thesis on understanding the political survival of this Brazilian political leader after, like 25 years after he had left office, and still kind of was able to control the party organization in a context in which party leaders are supposed to be being connected to the state, right? And so I came to learn from the prophet himself and study this. And I'm sitting right there, and Carlos Melendez is presenting, like in one of my first weeks here. And if I remember correctly, Carlos Melendez's research was about the political survival of Fujimorismo after Fujimori left power. And I'm sitting there, and then I have this kind of epiphany that that's kind of the same thing I was doing, but just by looking at it from a different context in a different country and learning different things about it. And I was like, that is extremely cool. And so that was one of the many ways in which this place changed my life. So I'm very grateful to be back. So I'm going to present to you work that I have together with two absolutely outstanding Harvard PhD students. Andrew Donahue, who is graduating this year and is writing just an amazing dissertation on courts and democratic backsliding in the Middle East. And John Gilbert, who is another Brazilian, who is a third-year PhD student at Harvard. I invite you to look for their work because they are just absolutely outstanding. And this is something we have worked on for a while, and I have done some kind of deepening of the theoretical discussion for today. So I'm very much looking forward to your thoughts on that. So we are now roughly 20 years into what many have called a global crisis of liberal democracy. And over these 20 years, the conversation has evolved. We've gone from asking how to prevent illiberal leaders from rising, leaders who promise to weaponize democracy against itself, to asking how to constrain them once they were already in power. But many other, this question is still urgent for places like Turkey, India, Mexico, right? How do you constrain a liberal leader? But many other places are already living the future. Brazil, Poland, South Korea. In these places, the liberal leaders who threatened their democracies were stopped and have actually left office. They lost elections, their coalitions collapsed, or they were removed. And these countries are now experiencing what we call a democratic reckoning, the high-stake process of holding former leaders accountable for their attacks on democracy. This reckoning forces democracies to answer a question that in some ways is trickier than the ones that they were answering before. And the question is, what do you do with the liberal leaders after they leave power? Because these leaders don't disappear. They remain politically powerful. They retain loyal bases. And as the American, Hungarian, and Israeli experience shows, a former illiberal leader who's not dealt with while out of power may come back and inflict far greater damage. So the question of how to hold these leaders accountable isn't abstract or retrospective. It has direct consequences for whether democracies can recover or whether they continue to erode. Democracies have responded to the challenges of democratic reckoning in three main ways. Formal conviction, court prosecuting and convicting leaders for anti-democratic conduct. Informal censure, to political elites, former allies, co-persons publicly condemning what the leader did. And trial by election, simply letting voters render judgments at the next ballot box. Each of these tools have a logic behind it, right? Formal conviction. If our leader broke the law, abused power, manipulated elections, incited insurrection, court exists precisely to adjudicate that. Conviction sends an unambiguous institutional signal that what happened was not just politically wrong, but legally impermissible. It creates a record, it potentially bars the leader from running again, and it treats him the way any other citizen would be treated, right? Equal under the law. Why wouldn't we want that? Informal censure. We know from decades of research that ordinary voters take cues from their leaders, from leaders they trust. And if an illiberal leader's own former allies, his vice president, his former ministers, his congressional partners, publicly declare that what the leader did was wrong, that signal is uniquely credible. It can't be dismissed as partisan opposition. It's the people who know him best saying this went too far. The Ziblatt, for example, built an entire theory of democratic resilience precisely on that mechanism. In trial by election, the most intuitively democratic response, put the leader before the voters again and trust them to render judgment. Let democracy police itself. So each strategy is genuinely reasonable, each has serious theoretical backing, and in a less fraught moment, any of them might work cleanly. But as I will show you to in a moment, none of these tools is obviously dominant. Each carries costs alongside its benefits. And the people making the decisions in real time, the judges, the political elites, the party leaders, have been making them almost entirely without systematic evidence of which costs are largest, which benefits are real, and for whom. How democracies respond to the aftermath of an illiberal government and whether this democratic reckoning works remains largely untested until now. So here's what this paper does. We studied the public opinion consequences of two of the three tools that I just described, formal conviction and informal censure. We asked, do they actually work? Do they turn voters against illiberal leaders? And at what cost? To answer these questions, we leverage what's arguably the most consequential episode of democratic reckoning in Latin America of the last decade. In June 2023, Brazil's Superior Electoral Court convicted former President Jair Bolsonaro by a vote of 5-2 for abusing political power in his attacks on the electoral system and banned him from office until 2030. And then in September 2025, Brazil's Supreme Court convicted him again, this time for attempting to prevent the peaceful transfer of power, and when that failed, to remove his successor by force. Jair Bolsonaro is now serving a 27-year prison sentence under house arrest. So one of the world's largest new democracies has convicted and imprisoned a former president who threatened it. That right there is the American dream. Right? We conducted a survey experiment with 5,800 Brazilian citizens less than a year ago. Less than a year after the first conviction, right? So after 2023, but before Bolsonaro was arrested. Respondents were randomly assigned to one of three conditions: information about Bolsonaro's legal conviction, information about criticism from his own former vice president, or a control condition. And this design allows us to measure the democratic benefits of accountability and its democratic costs separately and simultaneously. So here's what we find. Legal accountability works. Modestly, but it works. Information about the conviction reduced voting tension for Bolsonaro, particularly among centrist and ambivalent voters. But both legal and elite accountability generate backlash. Not just against the conviction, against whoever sought to hold the leader accountable, against the norm that electoral losers must accept defeat, against the very democratic principles the accountability intervention was meant to uphold. Both the benefit and the cost of accountability are thus real, and they are inseparable. We call this the accountability dilemma. Right? Any attempt to hold an illiberal leader accountable confronts a fundamental trade-off. On one side, accountability can work, a court conviction, a condemnation from a former ally. Each can signal to citizens that the leader's behavior was unacceptable and persuade some of them to withdraw their support. This protects democracy by reducing the odds of the leader coming back to power. But on the other side, and this is what the existing literature has largely led, these same acts of accountability confirm the illiberal narrative. The narrative of a fundamental, irreconcilable conflict between liberal institutions and the political leader who challenged them. For citizens already accustomed to that narrative, accountability is injustice. It's another iteration of the same conflict they lived through for years. When that happens, persecution doesn't undermine a leader, it validates him. It emboldens his movement, it deepens cynicism toward the very institutions being used to hold him accountable. The act of defending democracy then can paradoxically also erode. So here's how we think about this more formally. We are predicting effects on three outcomes. Rejection of the liberal leader, that's the most direct test of whether accountability works. Trust in the messenger imposing accountability. And commitment to democratic norms, the deepest outcome because it captures whether accountability is strengthening, eroding the foundations democracies run on. And we have two types of accountability to test, right? We are testing legal, which is the court conviction of Bolsonaro, and elite accountability, which is when an ally condemns him publicly. If we go back to classic views on how democratic accountability works, we find an optimistic set of predictions. Classic views would predict both forms of accountability increased opposition to the liberal leader. Just a clicker somewhere? No, too bad. So classic view, accountability will increase rejection of the liberal leader. The mechanism here is informational, right? So a court conviction tells citizens that the leader's behavior wasn't just politically controversial, it was legally impermissible. A former ally tells citizens that even the people who know him best think he went too far. These are credible signals, and credible signals should move people. They should also strengthen trust in the messenger. So a court that acts with institutional courage should gain legitimacy in the eyes of citizens who value the rule of law. An elite who speaks out at personal cost should gain credibility as someone who places democratic principle above self-interest. The classic view expects accountability to strengthen commitment to democratic norms, right? Reinforcing the foundational idea that no one is above the law, that anti-democratic behavior has consequences, and that the system can defend itself. So this is an optimistic view. It expects accountability to do what's designed to do. And in a healthy democracy, one where illiberal behavior was a bolt from the blue, a genuine shock to a civic culture built on democratic trust, that's probably what we would observe. Now, the pessimists among us, those who have been doom scrolling, would predict the opposite, right? Accountability doesn't reduce support for leader. It rallies his base. It confirms everything that we were told, that the institutions were out to get him, that the whole apparatus of accountability is just another weapon in the hands of his enemies. Support for the leader hardens, the conviction becomes a badge of honor. Trusting the messenger falls in the pessimistic view. The court that convicted the leader is now the court that attacked the leader. The former ally who spoke out is now a traitor. And democratic norms erode because these norms are now associated with the side that used them as a sword. Why should anyone be bound by norms wielded selectively in bad faith against the dear leader? The pessimistic view is that accountability backfires, producing more cynicism, more polarization, more erosion of the very foundations it was meant to defend. So which of these two views is right? Both of them. And that's precisely the problem that we are trying to think about. In the specific environment of a society going through democratic reckoning after an illiberal government, a society that has lived through years of sustained attacks on institutions where the illiberal narrative of conflict between the leader and the hostile establishment has taken deep root, both the optimists and pessimists are describing something real. Not describing different people. They are describing different forces operating on the same people at the same time. So to understand why it's that, think about what the prior period of institutional conflict has done to the political landscape. For years, citizens watched and were told how to interpret an ongoing war between an illiberal leader and the institutions of democracy. Courts, press, electoral authorities, all cast as participants in a coordinated effort to destroy the leader and the movement he represents. This is not incidental to illiberal politics. This is the very core of it. So by the time the reckoning begins, that interpretive framework is already in place. Built over years, deliberately by the very leader, now being held accountable. He built it knowing that this moment would come. It is into this landscape that accountability speaks. Not a blank slate, not a civic culture waiting to be informed, but a polarized, conflict-saturated environment where every institutional act has already been pre-interpreted. Where the narrative infrastructure for reading accountability as persecution has been constructed in advance. When citizens receive information about accountability, court conviction, a former ally's condemnation, they experience two things simultaneously. Not one or the other, but both. On one hand, they experience a genuine informational signal. The leader broke the law, even some of his own people said so, the evidence is on the table. That signal does what informational signals are supposed to do. It moves people. It increases opposition to the leader. The classic story plays out. On the other hand, the very same act activates the narrative that has been years in the making. Courts are acting against the leader. Former allies are breaking ranks. These are not new events to voters who have spent years watching institutional conflict unfold. They are the latest iteration of the same story. As a consequence, cynicism deepens, trust falls, commitment to democratic norms weaken, because these norms are now inseparable in the minds of many voters from the conflict itself. So both stories play out at the same time in the same society. The accountability dilemma thus is not that some voters experience the benefit of accountability while others absorb the cost. That society experiences both simultaneously. The same act that reduces support for the liberal leader also erodes the legitimacy of the institutions doing the holding accountable. You cannot get one without the other. Yes.
Yeah, just a clarification question. I was wondering what your priors were in terms of who is going to show either behavior and then the finding of is a combination. Like, is this more like a story of those that pre-treatment, before exposed to information, were initial supporters of the illiberal leader, or is a mix of other people? I ask because that also matters if we are seeing this play out in a larger group of citizens that not necessarily were supporters of the illiberal candidate?
I am glad you asked that. So that is exactly where we are going, right? So there is some heterogeneity here, not in direction, but in intensity. So I think that will speak to what you're asking, I think. Among voters who are more ambivalent about the illiberal leader, so less absorbed into the conflict narrative, more genuinely open, the informational pull of the accountability is stronger. So the backlash effect, the accountability effect dominates. Voters move more on support for the leader than on trust in institutions. Among core supporters, citizens for whom the conflict narrative is the organizing framework of their entire political identity, the narrative pull is relatively stronger. The backlash effect dominates, and the accountability is in fact is smaller. They move more on trust and norms than on support for the leader. That's the heterogeneous prediction I have. The direction is the same for everyone. Everyone rejects the leader. Everyone rejects the leader more. Everyone becomes somewhat less trusting of the institutions holding him accountable. Everyone becomes less committed to the democratic norms being involved. And the dilemma is universal, only its intensity varies. And this is where the environment of democratic reckoning becomes decisive. Not because it determines who experiences which story, but because it determines how large the cost side is relative to the benefit side. In a society that has not been through years of sustained institutional conflict, the narrative infrastructure for reading accountability as persecution is weak. The informational pool is strong, the optimist story dominates. But in a society going through democratic reckoning after an illiberal government, where the narrative infrastructure has been carefully constructed, where institutional conflict has been normalized, the narrative pool is stronger. The cost side of the dilemma is larger. And in those environments, the net effect of accountability on democracy is genuinely uncertain. Brazil in 2023 is among the clearest case we have of exactly this environment. So by the time we fielded our survey, Bolsonaro had been out of office for 18 months, had been formally convicted by Brazil's highest electoral court for abusing power in his attacks of the electoral system, and had been banned from running for office. And his own vice president had publicly condemned anti-democratic conduct. So both accountability mechanisms that we theorize had actually happened. Not in a hypothetical scenario, but in the real world, in real states, in one of the largest democracies on the planet. But here's what makes Brazil an especially powerful case, and what surprised even us. When we surveyed Brazilians in May and June of 2024, so less than a year after Bolsonaro's first conviction, 74% of respondents either didn't know he had been convicted or actively believed it had not happened. Only 1 in 4 were correctly informed. This matters enormously here because it means that the information we provide in our treatment conditions was genuinely new to most respondents, right? We can credibly measure what happens when citizens first learn about accountability, not what happens when people already knew about it and are just hearing about it. So the design here is, I think, pretty clean. There are 5,800 respondents, and they were randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions. A formal conviction treatment, which I will call legal accountability in the slides that move forward. An informal censure condition, which I'll call elite accountability, and a control condition that have like a placebo text to them. In the legal condition, respondents received factual information about Bolsonaro's conviction, drawn directly from the electoral court's ruling. Specific about what laws he violated and what the court found. In the elite condition, respondents received a factually grounded quote from General Mourão, Bolsonaro's own former vice president, condemning anti-democratic conduct. This elite condition requires a moment of explanation, though, because designing it confronted us with a real-world constraint that is itself theoretically revealing. So we wanted a genuine condemnation of Bolsonaro from someone seen as a close ally at the time the survey was fielded, right? We wanted someone from inside the tent who was perceived as a member of the group to come out and say something bad about him. In theory, that should have been straightforward. Bolsonaro gave plenty of reasons for people to criticize him. In practice, we couldn't find an example. After former Justice Sergio Moro left office accusing the president of interfering in investigations related to his family's interest, no other senior Bolsonaro ally ever directly and unambiguously condemned him by name. They condemned the riots after January 8th. They condemned anti-democratic behavior broadly, but they did not condemn Bolsonaro. That absence is not incidental. It is precisely what our theory predicts, right? The cost of speaking out in a highly personalistic movement are severe enough that even the star Lava Jato judge, the man who put Lula in jail, was labeled as a traitor when he spoke out against Bolsonaro. From there on, everyone else found ways to criticize the conduct without criticizing the man. So what we did here was to use the best available approximation. So we took a real statement from Moro, in which he condemned attacks on democratic institutions as incompatible with the values of the right, and presented it in a way that made it appear directed as Bolsonaro. Appear directed at Bolsonaro's conduct specifically, rather than at the January 8th rioters, which were the actual target of his conduct. So the words here are real, the speaker was real, the conduct being condemned was real. We simply removed the reference and made it about Bolsonaro. And then debrief people, obviously, at the end of the survey that we had done this to. So two things follow from this, right? First, our deception was minimal. A reasonable respondent would make an inference that Moro himself would not entirely disown at that point. And second, a genuine condemnation, a direct condemnation from Moro would have been more powerful than what we use, right? This is a kind of a very conservative elite treatment. The control condition received like a placebo vignette about AI and investment. It was before AI was polarizing. You can read it. It's just a big pile of nothing. The guys say, well, yeah, AI can be good, it can be bad, but in the end, it will be good and bad at the same time. Like, it doesn't say anything about politics. We took it from another experiment that had used it too as placebo. And we block randomized this on prior Bolsonaro vote to ensure that we had balance across the arms, and everything here that I'm going to show you in the future was pre-registered for this experiment.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Why didn't you think of having a placebo that mentioned Bolsonaro in a kind of neutral way?
Well, the reason is because we thought that even if he was a highly polarizing figure, it would be really hard to talk about it in a neutral way, right? Like that it would evoke things that we wouldn't know what exactly was being evoked, right? So we know, as I'm going to show you, people will have very strong preferences about Bolsonaro. And we piloted different versions of this. And what came from the pilot was that when we mentioned Bolsonaro, you already met reactions about him that we just didn't know what they were, right? And I felt uncomfortable having to kind of guess what is it that people were thinking. This way, I knew that they were not thinking about him in this context. That's kind of my best guess. But that was the reason. So 5,800 respondents, 3 conditions, everything pre-registered. So here's what we find. Does accountability reduce support for the liberal leader? We asked the respondent 2 questions to measure that. First, how likely would you be to vote for former President Jair Bolsonaro if you were a candidate again in 2026? This is our measure of vote intention, right? The most behaviorally direct test of accountability and whether accountability is doing its job. And second, to what extent do you agree that Bolsonaro should be banned by the judiciary from running again? This captures support for the legal sanction itself. So the outcomes will be all standardized, so you should read this as kind of the change in standard deviation in the observed outcome, right? The dashed line here is the no. Anything to the left, there's no dash line yet, but anything to the left of it in the vote for Bolsonaro will mean people are less likely to vote for Bolsonaro. Everything to the right of it in the ban Bolsonaro means that people are supporting more banning. So we look at the legal accountability treatment first. The effect of vote intention is statistically significant in the predicted direction. A 6-sentence vignette about the TSE convicting Bolsonaro moved vote intention roughly 0.04 standard deviations against him. That is a modest effect, but this is a minimal treatment, right? It's a one-shot treatment targeting an online sample of younger and more educated Brazilians than the average Brazilian. These are the people least likely to be uninformed and movable. So this is the lower bound of what a treatment would look like. And it moves, right? The classic accountability story is not fiction. Support for banning Bolsonaro also increases significantly, right? Citizens who learned about the conviction became more supportive of the legal consequence it imposed. Now look at elite accountability. Now, right? So the confidence intervals cross zero on both outcomes. Mourão's combination had no discernible effect on vote intention for Bolsonaro and no effect on support for banning him. And this is kind of precisely estimated no, right? This is, we had almost 6,000 people. This is, or 2,000 people in this arm. We have more than enough power to detect this. So the average effect of accountability, specifically legal accountability, is real, but modest. Yes.
How do you differentiate for the legal part, like something like a social desirability bias? So people hear that, oh, Bolsonaro was convicted. So now their response could just be to show the surveyor that if someone is convicted, I don't support them, versus actually finding out that this conviction has happened and that changes their view.
Well, so to some degree, I can't say much about this because we are limited by the instrument, right? Like I couldn't force people to actually vote for Bolsonaro and see whether they actually would change their behavior, right? Here I am in many ways reacting to what they tell me, and I'm limited in my ability to do this. What I would tell you is that if they were showing kind of pure social desirability bias, we would expect some kind of story that's similar to what I called the kind of classic optimistic view, because that's what a social desirability bias would show, right? That they were kind of satisfying what the interviewer was asking by kind of giving you kind of the expected social answer. But that's not what I'm going to show. I'm going to show you precisely the kind of accountability effect, right? So people are the accountability dilemma. So here they are saying the right thing, but in the next one they are not. And so then we would need to explain why they are giving me the social desirable answer here, but not in the questions that will follow. Yes.
Do you expect that any of the negative, vote for Bolsonaro effect would be captured if in the fact that you are asking about a 2026 election rather than a post-2030 election? Because I could imagine that there could be a voter who would say, well, I wouldn't vote for him in 2026 if there's a court ban, but I would vote for him in 2032 because the ban has been lifted. Like how can you, or is there any way to account for kind of that particularity?
I'm sure there is. And I'm sure the 2024 version of me can come up with a better way of dealing with this. Right now, there isn't, right? And I think the reason we thought here is that by 2024, Bolsonaro is not being arrested yet. There are lots of things that were up in the air. I don't think anyone was sure he wouldn't run in 2026, right? Like up to this day, Brazilian pollsters are putting his name on the polls, right? So my thought back then is that, yes, some people can say, well, I won because he can't, right? And that could be part of this. But at that point, I think it was enough up in the air. Our impression at that point was that enough up in the air that it made sense to ask it this way, right? Now knowing what I know now, like I think now that it's obvious that he will not run, the man is under house arrest, then I would feel more strongly about it. But back then, I didn't. So I mean, I wish I could go back in time for so many reasons, but that's just one of them. Okay. So the average effect is real, but modest. So who is being persuaded and among whom does the effect concentrate? That's what we're going to turn next. So this figure shows the heterogeneous treatment effects on vote intention broken down by pre-treatment favorability towards Bolsonaro. The vertical axis here, the y-axis, runs from one, which is very unfavorable views of Bolsonaro, to very favorable views of Bolsonaro. So among respondents who already had very unfavorable real views of Bolsonaro, so a 1 on the scale, the legal treatment has significantly no effect, right? These citizens needed no convincing. They were already not going to vote for Bolsonaro. Among respondents who were undecided, on the fence about Bolsonaro, the legal treatment produced the largest effect in the entire figure. The accountability signals reach them, updates their beliefs, and move them away from the leader. The effect here is large and statistically significant. And here's the find that should give us a little bit of hope, right? Even among respondents with a very favorable opinion of Bolsonaro, a 5, the legal treatment produced a small and borderline significant negative effect. Some of even his strong supporters updated when confronted with factual information about the conviction. So legal accountability works on support for the leader, right? And it works the way we predicted before. It's strongest among ambivalent voters, not as strong among strong Bolsonaro supporters. Now, that's how it happens across different groups. And the question is, why do we get this outcome? So what is the mechanism here? We tested 3 proposed pathways. First, does accountability reduce perception that the conviction is political persecution? Right. So we asked respondents, how much do you agree that the judicial proceedings against Bolsonaro are political persecution? And if accountability is working through like a legitimacy channel, that should go down. Second, does kind of condemnation, either formal or informal or like legal or elite condemnation, change perceptions of Bolsonaro's democratic character? So we asked people to rate whether they thought Bolsonaro was very anti-democratic up to very democratic. And third, does it shift beliefs about what the kind of socially acceptable answer is, right? So we asked Brazilians, we asked respondents, how many Brazilians do you think agree that Bolsonaro is unfit for office again? So the results here are theoretically revealing, I think, even if they don't look super exciting at first sight. So look at this first mechanism here, which is the mechanism for elite treatment. So Mourão condemning Bolsonaro did nothing on support for Bolsonaro. That's what I showed you before. But it significantly increased the perception that the prosecution is politically motivated. Not decreasing it, increasing it. A co-partisan speaking out, rather than lending legitimacy to the accountability process, makes respondents more likely to see the whole thing as a political attack. This is the narrative conflict mechanism operating in real time, right? So the former allies' words drive into a pre-built interpretive framework and are read as another front in the same war. The message does not land, it confirms the narrative. For legal accountability, the mechanisms are kind of directionally consistent with the persuasion story, particularly the perception of Bolsonaro as being less democratic, but we can make much out of them from here. So the broader takeaway from this is that we do not find strong evidence for why legal accountability moves vote intention, but we find clear evidence of why elite accountability fails. It's because it activates the narrative it was meant to disrupt. So now the cost side. The figure shows backlash against the messengers of accountability. Crucially, both outcomes are measured as changes within individuals. So we asked about trust in the judiciary and favorability towards Mourão, both before and after treatment, and what we show here is the change. Both effects are statistically significant, but look at the magnitude. So the legal treatment reduces trust in the judiciary by about 0.05 standard deviations, real but modest. And we think that's because courts have a degree of institutional insulation, right? Like their legitimacy is grounded in something broader than any one simple ruling. So they can absorb more of the hit. Now look at what happened with Mourão. The elite treatment reduced favorability towards the vice president by approximately 0.2 standard deviations, 4 times the damage absorbed by the judiciary and twice the size of common treatment defects in this literature about elite messaging. A political figure who speaks out pays a severe, immediate reputational price. This asymmetry is one of the paper, I think, most practically significant findings, right? Courts can survive the cost of holding an illiberal leader accountable. Individual political elites cannot. And if you are an elite politician, watching Mourão's favorability collapse after a single little vote survey experiment, imagine what a sustained real-world campaign of condemnation by the leader would cost you. Right? The incentive to remain silent here is perfectly rational. It's arithmetic. So the most consequential finding of this paper, though, is in this next slide, I think. We measured 3 normative outcomes. Loser consent, so respondents were asked how much they agree that losing candidates should always accept the results of elections. And that's perhaps the most foundational norm in democratic theory. Punishment of anti-democratic conduct when sore losers emerge, right? So when losing candidates who try to prevent the inauguration of the election winner, and we ask whether they should be punished. And support for militant democracy. So whether politicians convicted of electoral crimes should be banned from running again in the future, even if a majority of voters support them. So that being support for the kind of specific kind of sanction that Bolsonaro received. So here again, negative effects mean less support for each norm. Both the legal and the elite treatment significantly reduce support for loser consent. Citizens who learned that accountability, either through conviction or through Mourão's condemnation, became less likely to agree that defeated candidates must always accept election results. The most foundational norm in democratic theory became less credible to respondents who had just witnessed an attack on democratic accountability. Likewise, both treatment reduced support for punishing sore losers who try to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. And then what I think is the sharpest irony here, the legal treatment information about a court conviction for electoral crime significantly reduced support for the principle that politicians convicted of crimes should be banned from running again. So exposure to an actual limited instance of militant democracy makes respondents less supportive of militant democracy as a principle. So accountability does not just fail to strengthen democratic norms, it weakens them. The act of defending democracy erodes the normative infrastructure of democracy. And the final piece, I think, shows where this erosion is most severe, right? And here are again heterogeneous effects on loser consent and support for banning convicted politicians by pretreatment favorability of Bolsonaro. I dropped the middle outcome just for clarity. So among respondents with the most favorable pretreatment attitude towards Bolsonaro, both legal treatment and the elite treatment are large and statistically significant. Support for loser consent drops substantially. Support for banning convicted politicians drops substantially. The cost side of the dilemma is largest for those who the conflict narrative runs deepest. But look at respondents who were unfavorable towards Bolsonaro, right? The ones and twos. Even for them, accountability has a cost. Not as severe, not as clean, but negative. So the dilemma is universal. It varies the intensity. The direction does not. So this is the accountability dilemma measured in Brazil in 2024. So what do these findings mean for the actors that must decide whether to pursue accountability? For courts, the picture is sobering, but not discouraging. Courts can achieve real democratic benefits, reducing support for the illiberal leader, particularly among ambivalent voters. If the goal is to make the leader's return less likely, the evidence suggests that courts can contribute to that. Modestly, but they can. And they are also more resilient to backlash than individual politicians because their legitimacy, court's legitimacy, is grounded in institutional history, not any single ruling. They absorb the hit and continue functioning. But the deeper warning here is that the same act of conviction that reduces support for the leader also reduces support for banning convicted politicians, the very sanction that courts just imposed. So courts acting to defend democracy may simultaneously be weakening public support for the tools they use to do so. And if this dynamic compounds over time, if each time a reckoning leaves each reckoning leaves the institutional landscape more degraded, the long run cost could dwarf the short run benefit of holding leaders accountable. So courts can act, they should act, but they should act knowing that every intervention carries cost beyond the immediate case. For political elites, the picture is starker, right? The expected value of elite accountability, of a co-partisan speaking out against an illiberal former leader, is in this environment close to zero on the benefit side and severely negative on the cost side. Zero persuasive benefit, Mourão's condemnation moved no one against Bolsonaro. Severe reputational cost for him, his favorability ratings dropped 4 times more than the judiciary's. And a hidden accountability cost, right? Elite accountability increased perception that the prosecution was politically motivated. Speaking out contaminated the accountability process rather than lending it credibility. Our findings does help explain empirically, I think, why elite gatekeeping is so rare. It's not that potential critics lack information or secretly approve of what's happening. It's that the incentive structure is deeply hostile, zero benefit, major costs, a base that reads condemnation as betrayal, and a message that will be absorbed into the conflict narrative rather than disruptive. There's also a deeper structural paradox in these findings that I want to name explicitly. And I give full credit to Andrew for coming with this realization. That the logic of democratic accountability assumes that the right moment to hold the leader accountable is after the evidence is in, right? The reckoning comes after the attacks. Because by then, the case is clear. The anti-democratic behavior is on the record. The legal violations are documented, and that's when you can judge them and punish. But our findings suggest that the moment when the evidence is strongest is also the moment when the political conditions for accountability are worst. Here's why, right? The liberal leader does not simply commit anti-democratic acts in ways to be held accountable. He spends his time and power building the interpretive infrastructure that will make accountability impossible to impose without cost. He attacks the courts so that when the courts act, people see it as confirmation. He attacks former allies so that when allies speak out, people read it as betrayal. And he attacks the electoral system so that when elections don't go his way, people read it as evidence of fraud. So by the time the reckoning begins, the leader has already pre-built the defense. The very acts of accountability that democracies rely on to arrive into a landscape he designed to receive them as persecution rather than justice. That's the paradox of retrospective justice in democratic reckoning. The legal case is strongest when the political case is weakest. And the evidence is clearest when the electorate is most saturated by the conflict narrative. There may be no clean resolution to this paradox, but naming it precisely, I think, is a necessary step towards navigating it. Okay, so I want to end where I began, right? 20 years into a global crisis of liberal democracies, many countries have lived through the full cycle. The rise of the liberal threat, the government of the liberal leaders, the removal of the liberal leaders. And now they are in the reckoning, trying to hold the leaders accountable. trying to determine whether accountability helps democracy recover or whether the act of defending democracy can erode it further. So we claim that our paper provides the first experimental evidence of these questions. And I think the answer is uncomfortable but necessary. Accountability works partially, modestly, for some voters on some outcomes, but the informational channel is real. Courts acting with institutional courage can make a difference. But accountability also has costs. It erodes trust in the very institutions doing the defending. It weakens commitment to the very norms being invoked. It confirms the narrative the liberal leaders spent years building. This is not reason to abandon accountability. Right? A democratic system that refuses to hold anti-democratic leaders accountable for fear of backlash has already capitulated. And the cost of impunity, the cost of doing nothing, as the American experience shows, are certainly much larger than any kind of cost that I just showed, right? It is reason to pursue accountability with clear eyes, with realistic expectations, with attention to the environment in which it's attempted, and with recognition that the leader being held accountable has spent years preparing exactly for this moment, has built the narrative infrastructure, consolidated the personalistic movement, politicized the institutions, precisely so that when the reckoning comes, it will be as costly as possible for those imposing it. So democratic reckoning may be a path for recovery, but it's a treacherous path. And navigating it requires understanding its dangers, which is what I tried to do to you today. Thank you. I agree with that. Let me drink.
This is a clarification question. Back in the slides, when you had the arrows pointing up and down, there were two slides. One was for, I think, Bolsonaro supporters.
Yeah.
And the other one was for who?
For ambivalent voters, so voters who were not kind of strongly anti-Bolsonaro, the voters who didn't have a strong opinion to begin with.
That's what I thought. So I'm curious about how the anti-Bolsonaro voters responded to those treatments.
Right. So they respond. So two things, right? So for this one, they seem for the kind of norms thing, anti-Bolsonaro people, so the people who saw him least favorably and were more likely to vote for Lula, kind of got some of the norms effective. They also, the kind of petistas in the sample also became less democratic after these treatments. For this one, we didn't really find an effect. So for the petistas, the different treatments didn't really matter. And I am guessing that is because they were already they were not likely to vote for Bolsonaro to begin with, right? So there's like a floor effect here. I couldn't really move them further against him just because they were just not voting for him to begin with, right? And so that's why I only kind of theoretically made prediction for this two, because here there's like a floor effect and I couldn't go farther. But here I could, right? And so, and I think here is kind of the story that I'm trying to tell, right? Even for the petistas in the sample, their response to the norm question became less supportive of democracy. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really timely to start thinking. You did a great job saying, so 20 years in, we need to start worrying about what comes next, especially when these people are still around. And it's a very nuanced story that you're telling. I think it's very important. So just two comments. One big picture, like before getting into the nitty-gritty of the subgroup effects, I think one could see a story here that you're not emphasizing enough, and that reminds me a bit of the book by Ezequiel and Nara and Paula, right? Like where the overall effect, where you find an all effect of the elite sanctioning, but a condemnation of elite sanctioning, but an effect of the judicial process and no condemnation would be actually something positive in that people perceive judicial processes more fair. Notwithstanding what's happening today in Brazil, but at that time, right? Like it's a fair way of dealing with these behaviors, so they react by sanctioning Bolsonaro and deeming that process as fair, whereas the other one not. So that actually is accountability works when it's perceived as fair, not when it's politicized, right? Right. So I think it would be useful to engage with that. I think in general, because I think the implications are slightly different, right? Especially in an environment of polarization, actually it will be a positive story. But then the other thing is just now pushing you a bit on the interpretation of the evidence. It's like the subgroup effect results are very heterogeneous across outcomes and themselves, right? And it's very difficult to pin down mechanisms with quantitative evidence. I see that, but if the overall effect on opinions of Bolsonaro is driven by those ambivalent guys, and you want to pin down the mechanism, then you should find that the subgroup effect for the mechanism you're positing also matches, right? But actually you have different things, right? So could you walk back to a figure on norms, but the subgroup effect? Sorry, it's like towards the end, right? So it's hard to see the norm story as lining up with the other story, right? Because you're not moving the ambivalent guys there. And actually, the more Bolsonaro people are the ones who are reacting negatively to banning. But banning is personalized on Bolsonaro, whereas loser consent is an abstract principle.
Right.
So I'm not sure that the norm story is on the same like causal path than the rest. So I'm not sure whether it's clear that the evidence is telling you that the accountability backlash is working through norms. I think I see much more of a lining up between the Bolsonaro evaluation and the evaluation of elites and the judiciary, but this thing I don't think is lining up because the subgroup effects actually don't line up.
Right.
So, and that outcome is very personalized on Bolsonaro, whereas that one is an abstract principle.
Right. So, 2 points. So the narrow point on whether this is personalized or not, we try to make it less personalized. So the question that this outcomes are concerned about is not about, like, doesn't mention Bolsonaro. I have no illusion that people are thinking about Bolsonaro, but it doesn't mention, right? It's this kind of question: how much do you agree with this abstract principle, right? I don't say that, but how much do you agree with that politicians convicted for electoral crimes should be banned from running again in the future, even if a majority of voters support them? I am sure that some voters look at this and said, do you agree with Bolsonaro? But we asked that before, right? And so we hear when we try to make it more general. That's the response to the narrow point. I can see the point. I think we tried to make it less in that way. Now to the more, I think the most important problem, which is that the way I framed this is that there wasn't, here we should have a big effect here and a smaller effect here. And I think we see among the kind of petistas, but we really do not see here. Yes, I see that too. And come back to me.
Yeah, no.
I'll think, because yes, that's what I expected. I can't tell you exactly what's happening. I do not have a great answer to.
It's fine if you don't move that, but then it's not part of the story.
Yeah.
So
the reason why I kept the story is because it happens here, right? So like this is precise, like the fact that this goes this way is precisely kind of the way we have thought about it. And also because when it comes to the support for the loser consent norm, people like the petistas are somewhat kind of negative side of the story, right? So it's really these people here that are not working. And I do not have a great answer to it. I wish I had. I see the problem. And that's what I feel.
Yeah, I guess for me, it's important to try to understand those borders in the middle, right? And so to separate more like the ideology and potential backlash, because it goes against what you have been believing, and just resistance to that out of, I don't know, someone being proud, right? And then you are saying, well, you have been wrong, you don't accept that regardless of what's going on. But I wonder whether the results in general, I mean, can be interpreted as just this accountability paradox or trade-off. Wouldn't be like an interpretation, and I'm trying to understand the ones in the middle, but more like taking your perspective, that there is accountability like across. Basically, people are protesting not only the illiberal candidate, but they are protesting the institutions themselves for not doing anything prior, or how is that we got to here, right? Even among those anti-Bolsonarista, even they're like, come on, like this should have never happened now, or even those in the middle that are not as political. And so, yeah, like I had trouble understanding the more like normative aspect of democracy. I mean, I can see these two questions getting at some of that, but even with that, like, I guess just like the middle part here, not showing an effect on number 3 and the loser consent, it might be that, they are very dissatisfied, like with the system in general, how it works. So it's more about the performance, and therefore that can be called also accountability. It's like everything from the leader to the institutions to the regime doesn't work. I guess it's just a matter of semantic framing, but would you consider that as a fair interpretation that's like certain subpopulations here and maybe even the majority of voters might make the system accountable? All of the above, right? The leader and even like the messenger. Come on, like seriously, you were, a friend. You were with this guy, and so is it just are we just seeing disaffected citizens in general, and therefore accountability, but more in a, like in a way of, everything is not good.
Thank you for that. That's interesting. I think I have two reactions, right? So from one hand, I would have to think through about this argument to think whether the empirical predictions would be exactly the same or not. But I think from the perspective of what I'm trying to argue broadly, the point I'm making could be aligned with what you said, because it's this idea that in this moment in which we are in this post-liberal conflict situation, right? Then voters might be pissed off at everyone, at the institutions and the leader. And what we are seeing here is essentially their reaction. Accountability might be an optimistic way of talking about it. Like here they are reacting negatively to the institutional conflict that has been created between the liberal leader and the institutions. And so you could say that what you're seeing here is essentially voters getting these questions and saying, no, this whole thing is bad. So when you tell me, you ask me about Bolsonaro, things is bad. You ask me about course, everything's bad. I think that is a kind of version of the story, but in many ways it's kind of contained in the context of this post-liberal democratic reckoning. And so my initial reaction to it is that it is probably a smaller difference than I think we are making, because it's happening in the same context, and it's precisely the democratic reckoning that's driving this, that's also driving that story. Unless we can come up with more different theoretical, empirical predictions of what things are going to happen. But right now, I think that the idea here is that there's one way in which we call what they are doing here accountability, and there's one way in which we call it backlash. And empirically, I don't have a great way to differentiate these two, and I think they might actually be just the same thing.
Yeah, you might try just to check with other questions in the survey. I don't know, interest in politics or other more like general.
Yeah, well, it's one of those challenges of pre-registering stuff. I have a limited ability to go beyond what we did, but yes,
You always break that rule. Put that footnote.
I was against pre-registering to begin with. So now.
Thank you so much. So I have a question and an invitation. So I'll start with the invitation. I think you start with the framing of we are starting to evaluate this democratic reckoning. But sometimes when I hear these comments, it's not only from you, but in general, I think about, well, no, Bolsonaro is not the first former authoritarian leader to be judged or to run for office after some kind of reckoning. Mm-hmm. And I wonder to what extent this work fits into that older literature of the post-third world transitions to democracy. And I mean, if you have thought about it, great. If you haven't, it would be a good idea to kind of do that. The second thing is specifically about Brazil. And I was listening to the answer you were giving, Luis, and looking at some of these questions. And I was wondering to what extent what you're picking up is that both sides, Petistas and Bolsonaristas, had a pet peeve particularly with the judiciary system, right? So that question about convicted leaders, I'm like, yeah, if I am a Lula supporter, yes, absolutely, I do believe that a convicted leader should run for office and people should vote for it.
Right.
Right? So I wonder to what extent that's what you're measuring and if you have any way to kind of disentangle that.
So, so do I understand right? So the question is kind of about people's attitudes towards the judiciary to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, so specifically because Brazil is such a unique case in which both Lula and Bolsonaro have been tried like
Right.
this.
So I have two answers there. So the first one, we do ask people about their views on the judiciary and whether they think these things are fair and et cetera. And all those things are in the back here initially as kind of control, so it shouldn't be happening. But we do have these questions and we do look at whether people who had more positive attitudes towards the judiciary to begin with, or kind of saw the justice system as fairer to begin with, whether that actually changes things. And it changes things, I think, kind of in line with the story I'm telling, right? So we would expect the ones who have more negative views of the judiciary, so those who have bought into the narrative more, to be more persuaded by those things and react more, while those who have very positive views of the judiciary wouldn't be behaving this way. And that's kind of what we find, right? It's not a very clean effect, but it's the idea that those who have more negative views of the judiciary learn of these things, and then they are the ones in which a lot of this happens, and those who have more positive views, it's just not happening to the same degree. But thank you. Yes.
I have two small questions. One is that I'm understanding that most of your comparisons are against the control group, right? You
Yes.
were mentioning that some of the outcomes you measured in the same person, like before and after the
Yes.
treatment. So my question was in general, how much do you think this effect is about individuals changing their opinion in all of these areas at the same time, or if it is as it is a story that has kind of internal inconsistencies, right, as you were mentioning, or if it is that it's just a group effect in which there are more people moving on one side than on the other side, but they move either on the pessimistic or the optimistic way,
Right.
and not at the same time. And the second question that I had was somewhat related to what Laura was asking, which is that in this case, you're measuring opinion on Bolsonaro, which indirectly also measures opinion on Lula, right?
Yes.
But that is sort of in this case, and it is not a direct question about whether they are
Well, we
petistas
did
or
ask
not.
about opinion on Lula, and it's also in the background here.
But then the question that I had in mind was, how important is that as a scope condition, that there is kind of this clear alternative of a politician that is opposing this populistic possibility? I'm thinking about the case of Mexico, in which you have Morenismo and López Obrador, and there's nothing remotely as popular in the opposition that people might be thinking of or basing their comparison on. Would we still see this story, or is it only here as there is an alternative?
Yeah, do you want to answer this? It's a great question. Thank you for it. So on the first point, I have a hard time methodologically to separate the group from the individual effect, because what we are seeing here are just average effect over the survey experiment, right? So I can think about groups by breaking it into smaller groups and see how things change. And I've done this to some degree, but it's harder to tell you kind of the overall what's happening here. What I would tell you is that when we break it in groups, the groups kind of behave the way I'm telling you they expect to behave, right? So like, for example, here you do get that both more favorable and less favorable people are moving negatively, right? And so I think the argument that I'm trying to make is this is not like just a group pushing or in a group pulling in different directions, that this is a more general effect. But I am limited to the degree of the experiment, and that I'm essentially estimating average treatment effects here rather than anything else. When we do the interactions and I can break it into groups, I get the interactive effect, but then I'm only limited to what I can actually interact with. Now, whether the theory or the argument is kind of conditioned by the presence of a clear alternative or like a viable alternative, I had never thought about it this way. I think the theory was agnostic about it, and I wouldn't expect it to be dependent on that. But I think that kind of the first principles of the argument do not require it, right? The first principles of the argument is that in a context of democratic erosion, post-liberal government, what the alternative is not that, and I don't think it matters that much, right? This is about people reacting to what the leader did and what institutions are doing to that leader. What is happening beyond that, I'm not quite sure it matters that much. So I had not thought about it, and I wish I had a more full answer. But my sense is that it does. I would say it probably doesn't matter. There might be cases in which I would be convinced that it does, but I think theoretically,
Thank you. Excellent. I'm going to ask something similar to Laura's question, which is about what to my mind was the weirdest finding of all, which is on this slide now, and that's group one, the least favorable. So Laura asked you about, plausible explanation for this finding. What is your, I mean, I think it stands out, right? That it's groups 1 and 5 here that you move the most. Group five, right? I mean, that's what ex ante I would have hypothesized
right.
where you would see the most movement. But group 1, like that's just, I would have expected what you see for convicted band, right? Kind of a diminishing effect across all groups. That's not at all what we see for loser consent. What do you make of this?
Well, so this is an ex post facto explanation. I think the theory would predict something like this.
Yes.
My kind of version of this is that the argument I'm making is that this reaction will be strongest among those who have been involved in the discussion and the narrative about the institutional conflict between liberal institutions and the leader the most. And I would guess that Petistas are very informed and connect and care very much about this. I hadn't thought about it and think of what's happening as a political conflict between institutions and Bolsonaro. And that's why we get this. But I agree with you. I would expect this to look somewhat like this, right? Like you would expect this guy in the middle to be somewhat to this right, much more than this guy's. But that's not what happened. I think in the kind of ex post facto explanation I can tell you is that these are the two groups that are more into the narrative, while this group not as much, and therefore.
Yeah, but the theoretical expectation could have been that those are the groups that are most into the narrative, but it had the opposite effect for group 1, right? I mean, that is to make them more favorable to losers' consent.
Why?
Well, because they know that losers' consent is essential for an outcome that they would value.
Right, but I think like if I try to rationalize, my thought was that well, now they realize that kind of like losers' consent might not be like the loser doesn't. I don't know, the loser doesn't need to consent because then it's part of the conflict that they do not, and there's like a pushback and etc. I do not, I think that it could be, I think I can rationalize, we could rationalize the story here in which these guys are essentially like seeing it as part of the conflict and reacting to it in that way.
One other quick question, if I may. So it's about judicial attitudes toward judicial accountability, legal accountability. And I mean, for necessary reasons, right, of research design, I completely get what you did and I completely understand the findings, but I think there's, as you alluded to, with your argument about the huge downside of no judicial accountability. I mean, even, right, if you asked voters, if you asked survey respondents about complete lack of judicial accountability. So right, you might get a result among some of your 5 groups that they are negative about judicial accountability, but would be even more negative about lack of judicial accountability. It's an untestable counterfactual, but it's something, in terms of real world implications to think about. Like in the US, I don't know if this is the case, but I imagine that when the Supreme Court said it would not expedite Jack Smith's case against Trump, I mean, for some people, right, confidence in the Supreme Court plummets. Like, how can you fail to expedite this case?
Right.
It's a historically important case in which the prosecutor felt he had very strong evidence, and the Supreme Court said no. So, I would be shocked if that didn't cause some erosion in confidence in the Supreme Court among some group of survey respondents.
I agree 100%, and I think that emphasizes how tricky the position the democratic institutions are.
Yeah.
When we are in a moment of democratic reckoning, right? If you do something, there are all these costs. If you do nothing, you are in the American world in which some people think that you failed your constitutional duty at the same time in which you didn't punish the leader and the leader came back. And so I think, yes, 100%, I will make that point because I think that is exactly it helped us outscore the challenge here, right? Because this paper emerged because Andrew, Jean, and I were seeing the discussions happening both in Brazil and the United States about whether you should prosecute Trump, prosecute Bolsonaro, punish them, remove them from the ballot, and etc. And we had this impression that we were making arguments, we political scientists were making arguments without really knowing what the consequences of the different paths were. And I think you were absolutely right. There is this alternative path in which the judicial branch of power does nothing. And it pays a bigger price, or it pays another price among some voters for not doing nothing, right? And so the options for accountability institutions in this democratic reckoning moment are, I think, all bad, right? Every single course of action will cost you something. Either it will cost you for not doing something, either it will cost you for doing something. There is no good alternative. All you need to know is that there will be a price, and there will be some Supreme Court, some judicial systems that will pay the price, pay different prices, calculate them differently, and deal with it, right? But I think what your point makes, at least to me, is that yes, there will always be a price. Either you do this, and I think we could have estimated what would be the price of doing nothing and compare the two, right? And this price is like on levels of democracy, which is the point I made about Trump, but there is a price on the legitimacy of democratic institutions themselves. And I would, and here I'm kind of going out of anything I thought before, but I would guess that price is potentially larger than this one. I'm not quite sure if that's true, but it could be, right? Like that doing nothing not only costs you more in democracy as an outcome, but also in the legitimacy of democratic institutions themselves. Maybe.
It's possible that there are scope conditions to this dilemma. And South Korea would be an interesting test case, right? I mean, maybe you don't find a result similar to this in South Korea. Maybe there's much less of an accountability dilemma under some conditions.
So my understanding, as you know, I know very little about South Korea, but my understanding of reading the news about South Korea is that South Korea was slightly different from Brazil in the sense that it was kind of less deep into the kind of narrative of institutional conflict, right? President Moon had been president for less years than Bolsonaro had been president, and the conflict also kind of started, and it was felt somewhat like lightning blue sky for a society that wasn't thinking that like calling martial law would be an option that happened, right? There was obviously some conflict, but I think it was much less intense in the perception that there was this kind of state of institutional belligerence between the leader and the institutions wasn't as big as Brazil. So I would guess that the South Korean case is probably close to what the kind of optimistic view on accountability would be, that accountability would punish the leader and increase support for democracy, increase support for the courts, increase support for the Congress in the South Korean case. But be precisely because it was kind of less deep into the conflict than Brazil. But so that would be my guess. South Korea would probably, the accountability dilemma will probably be less severe than it was in Brazil. But yes.
I think I have.
Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Hi, first of all, congratulations, this is fantastic. I have just two minor points. The first one relates to sort of this idea of the less favorable towards Bolsonaro and this kind of like unexpected effect. And I think that there's perhaps like an underlying assumption that those that are on that category are also equally like pro-democratic, right? Which might not necessarily be the case. Like you can have petistas that are willing to completely sacrifice democracy to either see, you know, a petista candidate win or to see Bolsonaro like being stopped from office. So like I wonder if there's this kind of like giving you a tension between like, well, not necessarily, you know, those that are less favorable towards are necessarily pro-democratic voters, and whether that can help like interpret that result. And the other, I kept thinking about the comment that Abby gave you, like to try to help you distinguish or think about backlash and try to separate. Yeah. And I wonder whether there's something in the design of the survey in terms of the timing, like compare sort of like those that took the survey early versus those that took the survey relatively late. And if the idea is that sort of the more information, the more sort of like clear the accountability mechanism is, then probably there might be like a difference that you could exploit, or whether there's something along the lines of like how sophisticated the individuals are, and you could sort of like split that in terms of just to try to sort of distill this from like a backlash interpretation.
Yeah, and the last point, we not have a direct measure of sophistication. All we could measure was kind of social class, and that doesn't really, it's a terrible measure, but that's kind of, it doesn't really show any major difference. We do have on information, we actually have direct measure of information. We ask people, do you know whether Bolsonaro was convicted? And then like people could say, yes, he has been convicted, no, he has not been convicted, or I don't know. And the right answer was, yes, he has been convicted. And so we know whether people just don't know or whether they kind of thought they knew and were wrong. And we can look into this. I will be honest with you, I don't remember exactly what I find there, but we do have like direct measure of information. And so I'll definitely look into it.
Great project, and thanks for the presentation, super insightful. I guess I have a small comment and two questions. The small comment is, I really like your initial framing of the three forms of accountability, but it seems that at the end of the day, for you, everything runs through the electoral accountability, right? That's the experiment, because otherwise, right, we think about legal accountability, the guys in prison, period. If people like it or not, that's a different issue. And similarly with elites, it would be you have distancing, right, with renewables distancing, and that's kind of a different mechanism. So I think there is an implicit story here, which is that all of those forms are relevant, but at the end of the day, you need this leader to lose elections, so electoral accountability really matters. Then I'm trying to understand, and I think many questions go in that direction, whether you're trying to tell a story about kind of a weird psychological trait of voters or about net effects, right? So throughout the presentation, you seem to imply at multiple times that these kind of contradictory effects, this paradox that you identify, happens for individual voters at different levels, right, based on their initial preconditions, whatever. So you have different expectations for different types of individuals, but in some ways the implication is that everybody would, in principle, be less willing to vote for Bolsonaro and more willing to distrust the democratic institutions. But then when we look at the breakdowns, and this goes back to Luis's question, right, it seems that it's not completely clear to me that that's the story, and it's not completely clear to me that that's the story that you want to tell, or if this is just a story about different segments in the electorate reacting in different ways. So the different voters are swayed by the information, and then other sectors of the electorate are more distrustful of the institutions. And so what you have at the end of the day, if you're a politician planning on accountability or a court planning on accountability, you need to calculate what the net effects for democracy are going to be, right? Because different segments of the electorate are going to do different things. And so in that case, the story is completely different. You have some sort of trade-off, but then it's a calculation politicians all the time makes, which is like, okay, when we add up all the net effects, what's the result going to be?
Right.
So I would like to hear your what's kind of the story that you really want to tell. And especially if it's the last one about net effects, I guess my question, this goes back to Laura's point, is to what extent is this story different, if it is different, from stories about transitional justice, right? So we have some experimentalism on transitional justice, like Mara Repkin and others, but more generally, it seems to me that that's a kind of trade-off that courts and politicians think about transitional justice based on that.
Okay, thank you. So on the first point, right? I think obviously horizontal accountability can end in itself. I think that was the first point you made. And then, but there's an argument that you by one horizontal accountability, because horizontal accountability informs vertical accountability, right? And that and that's what I think we are looking at, right? So we were, again, this emerged in the context of thinking about how do you protect democracies from liberal leaders once they came back to power. And it's critical that you keep them out of office. It seems to me that leaders who return to power do a lot of damage. And so in some ways, I think the relevant question is not only kind of like on the kind of public opinion effects of horizontal accountability per se, which is kind of like, do you think the courts did properly? Do you think this was deserved or et cetera? But on whether that creates vertical accountability. And that's because it was always this kind of major discussion about why courts should or should not do this. It's like because it may inform voters and push voters in this direction, the other direction. So we were thinking about this debate, right? And I fully concede that horizontal accountability ends in itself, but I think there is an interesting political science question, but there was obviously a political debate about the potential vertical accountability consequences of horizontal accountability, and that's what we're trying to get, right? Now, on whether this is the net effects, as you said, or this kind of like general story, I think the story I want to tell is that there is a general story. And the reason why I think that's the case is twofold. The first one is because I think in this moment of democratic reckoning, at least that's my impression from Brazil, right? While it is potentially true, they would expect like groups to go in different directions. There is this feeling that everything that's happening is part of the conflict, right? And I think that's part of the story that we were missing here. That we thought that what was happening here, that some people would like it, some people wouldn't like it, and that's kind of like the cost. And I think my impression that this is more profound than it, is that everyone kind of reacts to it the same way. And that's what I think I tried to show, right? Like that everyone kind of reacts to it in the same way. It's just kind of a difference in magnitude of your reaction, rather than you like it and going one direction and I don't like it and going a different direction. And I think that is a feature of this moment of democratic reckoning post-illiberal society, the post-liberal kind of government, right? We have all been taught to think about this conflict in a way and kind of react to it in similar ways. That's kind of how I would like to tell the story. And I think that's also somewhat, I think it's what transpired from the data. I will not actually, I think it's what transpired from the data with a few exceptions, but it is, I think it is a defensible position to make. Now, how different is this from transitional justice? I think the logic is probably similar. I just do not know enough about the literature to tell you whether kind of empirically what exactly are the contributions here, but I think you were absolutely right now that I think about it, that the logic of the story is somewhat similar, right? And you have here is that there are effects both on the kind of like actual political outcome, but also on the process of what's happening. And I think that is definitely related, so definitely. Sorry,
You're running out of time, so don't answer this.
Oh.
I just want to tell you because I'm gonna forget.
Okay,
At least I think you're running out of time, someone can correct me. Okay. I'm also obsessed with the ones.
yes,
And I know you have a pre-analysis plan, but I think that result is just going to be very interesting to anyone who listens to this or reads about this, so you should run heterogeneous effects on the ones. It strikes me that there's at least three groups that are in the ones. There are the Petistas, and that's why they're in the ones. Then there are the committed Democrats who are not necessarily Petistas, and that's why they're in the ones, right? Because Bolsonaro is not even a Democrat. And then there are people who are just disenchanted and pissed off, and that's why they're in the ones. They would be in the ones for any leader. And I can imagine those three groups behaving very differently in response to this, and that potentially driving so many weapons. Second, I just want to flag, I think Leon's point is actually more relevant as a scope initiative than you think, because I interpreted Leon's point as a statement about the structure of polarization. And I think that you need that in order for this key mechanism of yours, which is about the narrative of sort of persecution and illegitimacy of the institutions, to sort of be as powerful as it is. Okay, and I'll just stop there. So, okay, someone.
that's a fair point, yeah. Yeah, okay,
Don't.
I think we best end here, because we're.
Let me just say one final sentence, and that's it. The best thing would be to ban all politicians from running for office again.
Yes, that's the way of doing accountability. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Fernando.